Hey everyone, this is our lesson on cellular respiration. And by the end of this lesson, you should be able to analyze cellular respiration in terms of how energy is stored and released. And then we'll look at photosynthesis in an upcoming lesson and kind of compare them there. So first, let's make sure we understand how energy is released in our body. And the main way that we see that is digestion. So digestion is where our body breaks down the food that we eat into smaller, more manageable molecules that then can be used as energy in the form of ATP in the body. And the way that happens is through cellular respiration. So this breaks down the small molecules that from food, nutrients, things like that, and provides the energy in the form of ATP for us to be able to do everything else that our body has to do. So cellular respiration, the equation for that is glucose plus 6 waters will yield 6 carbon dioxides. With 6 oxygens will yield 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters and energy. So here's just the word formula for that. So we see that we take in sugars and we take in oxygen, which is why we breathe in oxygen. And as our body processes those, it releases CO2, water, and then the energy that we use on a daily basis. So this process itself actually takes place in the mitochondria. Remember, that's our powerhouse of the cell, and this is why, because this is where our energy is made. And it does this in both plants and animals. There are 2 types of cellular respiration that we're going to look at, which are aerobic, which means oxygen has to be present. And then we also have anaerobic, which means there is no oxygen present. So aerobic, you have to breathe. Anaerobic, you do not. Well, you don't need oxygen to make that happen. Obviously, you're still breathing. So let's first talk about aerobic. And our first step in aerobic respiration is glycolysis. So this is the breaking down of glucose, which is sugar. It cuts it in half, and that actually forms what's called pyruvic acid. This will be ready to enter the next step because there is oxygen available for that to happen. This happens in the cytoplasm of the cell, so in that jelly-like substance. And all respiration starts with this. Whether anaerobic or aerobic. But we know the next step, obviously it says we need oxygen, so that would be aerobic. So that glycolysis, that pyruvic acid, will then enter what's called the Krebs cycle. And this will break that acid down and produce the carbon dioxide and the waste that we don't obtain from the food or from respiration. And as that happens, we have the electron transport chain. This is like, if you see it, looks like it's within the membrane. And this is where phosphate groups get added back onto the adenosine diphosphate to make it triphosphate again so that we can reuse it and make more energy, save that energy, make those bonds and everything. So this will involve coenzymes because we have to move hydrogen ions across a gradient and all that good stuff. But just know we have to go through the electron transport chain to recharge the battery. So we can compare aerobic respiration to like a burning fireplace, as it says here. So fire needs a spark. That would be our energy, or ATP. It produces a lot of heat, which we know is also a form of energy. Fires produce carbon dioxide. You have to have oxygen for a fire to continue to burn. Fires have to be burning something like they have to have some sort of fuel source, which would be the glucose. And then fires do produce water, usually in the form of steam, but it's still water. So our next type is anaerobic respiration. And if there's no oxygen available, this is what the body will do. And there are 2 types of anaerobic respiration. The first one is lactic acid fermentation, and alcoholic fermentation. So we're going to compare these 2. So for lactic acid fermentation, animals can go through this cycle in particular. The pyruvic acid that's produced from the glycolysis step becomes lactic acid. And this occurs in your muscles when you go through strenuous exercise and you do not get enough oxygen. So if you've ever like worked out and then the next day or a couple hours later, your legs or your arms are so sore, and sometimes, people think it's, oh, I didn't stretch, or I didn't drink enough water, or I didn't do all these things, I'm cramping up. That's actually the lactic acid that builds up as your body is trying to break that back down. That's why it hurts. And then the reactants for lactic acid fermentation are glucose, and the products would be the lactic acid, ATP, and carbon dioxide. This will actually yield 2 ATP. So one thing to understand here is since oxygen is not available to make these processes work very efficiently, anaerobic respiration does not release nearly as much ATP as aerobic does. Aerobic is like 36 to 40, I think 36, 38 ATP, whereas anaerobic is not nearly as much. One form only produces 2 ATP. The other one is alcoholic fermentation. So yeast, bacteria, and plants will enter this cycle. So humans, animals do not. The pyruvic acid is broken down into carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol. The reactants here are glucose, so that does obviously have to be present to go through glycolysis. And then the products are ethyl alcohol, ATP, and carbon dioxide. This is why when we like alcoholic beverages tend to come from plants because they can go through this fermentation process. And the energy that you yield from here is also only 2 ATP, so not much at all. So aerobic respiration gives off way more energy per molecule of glucose than anaerobic does. And the purpose of aerobic cellular respiration is that it uses oxygen to make large amounts of ATP. So as you can see here, 36 to 38. The reactants of cellular respiration are glucose and oxygen. The products of cellular respiration are going to be CO2, water, and ATP. And then the types of organisms that can undergo cellular respiration are both plants and animals.